does God hate women? I have no idea, naturally, but the point of the question really is, do religions act as if God hates women? And the answer to that very often is yes. One of the recent examples of this, which some of you may be all too familiar with, but I'm going to go all through it again anyway, is Savita Halappanavar. She died in University Hospital, Galway, a few weeks ago, in October. She died of a miscarriage, basically, which is something that you would think shouldn't happen, or at least should be very rare at this time in history. She woke up Sunday morning with a backache, and her husband drove both of them to the hospital. And the hospital found that she was having a miscarriage, and it was in progress, and there was no chance for the fetus. Her pregnancy was essentially over, but the miscarriage wasn't. And the normal thing to do in that situation is an evacuation. And she requested a termination, and the hospital refused. And over the next 3 days, she developed a fever, she became very ill, and she was in severe pain, which was getting worse all the time. And repeatedly, over those 3 days, she and her husband Praveen requested again and again to have the pregnancy terminated, and repeatedly the hospital said no. And Praveen later reported that at one point one of the doctors told him, "This is a Catholic country." Finally on Wednesday, the reason they said no, and they didn't always explain this to them, the reason they said no was there was still a fetal heartbeat. And during the 3 days, they were constantly checking on the fetal heartbeat. And an excellent OBGYN in the U.S. who blogs, her name is Dr. Jen Gunter, and the blog is the same name, reports that the only time you ever find a hospital repeatedly checking a fetal pulse that way is if there's something wrong with what the hospital's doing. It's not a normal medical thing. There's no reason to check the pulse of a fetus that is already doomed because it has been miscarried, except for some kind of religious purpose that really has no business there. So for those 3 days, Savita was suffering. She was repeatedly asking for the abortion. The hospital was repeatedly saying no, and frantically checking the pulse, which kept being there. Finally on Wednesday, the pulse stopped, and they rushed her into surgery and did the evacuation, but it was too late, and she died. It is quite possible that this happens fairly routinely in Irish hospitals and just doesn't get reported. But Praveen was angry. Not surprisingly, Praveen Halappanavar was angry. So a few weeks later, he went to the media and told the media the story that I just outlined. And all hell broke loose. Ireland just kind of erupted in rage. And I was on Twitter sort of quite soon after the story broke, I think. And I kind of saw the eruption, I guess because I follow just exactly the right people who pay attention to this kind of stuff. But I just remember this avalanche of tweets about this. And so then I went to the hashtag, the Sophia hashtag, so then it was just a torrent of tweets, including from people who were already at the demonstration. And the demonstration was spontaneously organized in a matter of about 5 hours. And there was a pretty respectable crowd of people in front of the dial after about 5 hours after this news story came out, which shows you what a button this story pushed in Ireland. And there was another bigger demonstration the following Saturday, which was, I think, 3 days later, and that was actually about 20,000 people, including some MPs and some MPs for Europe. And I followed that on Twitter too, and it was very passionate and very intense, and it got a lot of media coverage. And it got a fair bit of coverage in the United States, And also there was a lot of coverage in Ireland of reaction around the world, including in the US. And there was one really interesting story by an Irish woman who's temporarily living in the US. She was living in California for a while. And she reports her American friends just expressing deep puzzlement and shock to her that this could happen in a modern country in this day and age. You know, Ireland, the Celtic Tiger, it's considered sort of part of the developed world. How could this be happening now? And what's interesting about that story is that it can happen in the US too, and it does. And the fact that people were so shocked by Ireland tells me that they don't realize that this is the situation also in the US. The reason it's the situation in the US is because there are a lot of Catholic hospitals in the US. And by Catholic hospitals, I mean hospitals that are administered as officially Catholic hospitals, which means that they have to follow church rules. And it can mean that church rules preempt medical rules. And this is something that doesn't get the kind of coverage that the Savita story got in the US yet. And this is something that needs to change. And a good example of that is the situation that happened in Phoenix, Arizona, 3 years ago. 3 years ago and then 2 years ago. And it's fairly parallel to Savita, although not exactly. In the autumn of 2009, a woman with 4 small children who was 11 weeks pregnant reported to the hospital and was told she had pulmonary hypertension and that she needed to end the pregnancy, because if she didn't, it would kill her and obviously the fetus with her. And before they could do that, the ethics committee had to decide on it, and it decided, yes, go ahead. And there was a nun on the ethics committee, Sister Margaret McBride, and she also said, okay, go ahead. So they went ahead, and she got the termination, and survived. Seems like a good outcome, although very sad that she didn't continue the one pregnancy, but that's, that's better than dying and leaving her 4 children orphans. But in stepped the Bishop of Phoenix. The Bishop of Phoenix, Thomas Olmsted, was very angry that this had happened, and he ended up excommunicating the nun who agreed to the abortion. Now, what is that saying? That is saying that the Bishop of Phoenix thought that the hospital should have said, no, you may not have this abortion, to make sure that you don't die of pulmonary hypertension. We would prefer to just let you die, and we would prefer to let your 4 children be without a mother. And this caused a lot of outrage in the US, but as a fairly isolated sort of one-off thing, again, with people not really realizing that this isn't a terribly unusual thing. It's, in fact, something that has at least the potential to happen a lot at Catholic hospitals, and probably does happen a lot, but it's hard to be exact about it because it flies under the radar, and because Catholic hospitals naturally don't report it as, oh, we let somebody die of a miscarriage. And they also don't tell patients what's going on. They don't tell patients, they don't fully inform patients about what their options are and what could be done. And I think U.S. citizens often think that the situation with Catholic, I used to think this until I read more about this, think that the situation with Catholic hospitals is, in a situation like that, they'll tell you, oh, well, we can't do that. We have a religious conscience, and we have the legal right to say, our conscience trumps what you need, so you have to go to this other hospital. And sometimes they do that, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes they just don't inform the patients that a medical procedure is available and that they need it, and patients just never realize that they're getting substandard care. For instance, with ectopic pregnancies. The standard of care for ectopic pregnancies, in which the fetus develops in the fallopian tube instead of in the uterus, which doesn't work because then the fallopian tube gets blown out. The standard of care is methotrexate, which dissolves the fetus, but Catholic hospitals refuse to do that. And they often don't tell patients that that's an option. And they either watch and wait, which is absolutely not what you're supposed to do. The rule is don't let the sun set on a ectopic pregnancy. Or they do an unnecessary invasive surgery, which can mess up the woman's fertility. So back to the Bishop of Phoenix. What happened was, he and the hospital fought for about a year, going back and forth, arguing about it. The hospital administration was very polite and civil with the bishop and very respectful, but it consistently said no. It refused to agree that it had done anything wrong, and it refused to promise that it would never do it again. And finally, in December 2010, the bishop wrote them a letter. And I want to read you the really good clause of this letter. I now ask that CHW, which is Catholic Healthcare West, and that's it's a big umbrella organization that includes St. Joseph's Hospital but is not limited to it. I now ask that CHW agree to the following requirements by Friday, December 17th, 2010. Only if all of these items are agreed to will I postpone any action against CHW and St. Joseph's Hospital. Specifically, I require the following in order for me to postpone any further canonical action directed against St. Joseph's Hospital. CHW must acknowledge in writing that the medical procedure that resulted in the abortion at St. Joseph's Hospital was a violation of ERD 47 and so will never occur again at St. Joseph's Hospital. In other words, the bishop was asking the administration to agree in writing never again to save a woman's life by performing an abortion when the fetus is already doomed by an underlying medical condition. Fortunately, the hospital, again, simply politely refused to agree. But there's no guarantee whatsoever that all Catholic hospital administrations have that kind of scrupulous attitude to the matter. And that is the situation in the U.S. Basically, that there are a large number of hospitals that are under Catholic administrations, and in many places, a Catholic hospital is all that's available for hours worth of travel. So if you're totally dependent on a Catholic hospital, it can be very dangerous if you're a pregnant woman. And it's a very bizarre situation because, in fact, in the U.S. there are laws that say no, you may not turn people away. You may not tell people they have to go to another hospital 80 miles away. And no, you certainly may not say, no, I'm not going to perform life-saving surgery. And yet, the laws are not really enforced. There's this creepy kind of tacit hands-off thing. And the ACLU and the National Women's Law Center have both tried to put pressure on the U.S. government to at least enforce the laws. And it would be nice to see them do more, like, for instance, just tell bishops to back off medical care, but that's probably too much even for the ACLU to ask. But even this polite request to please enforce the existing laws has so far at least led to nothing. And after the business with Sister Margaret McBride, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops drew up an explicit policy on this subject, and the policy is the same one that the Bishop of Phoenix enunciated to St. Joseph's Hospital. It is, you will never perform an abortion to save a woman's life, no matter if it means that she's going to die with pretty much certainty, and that the fetus is going with her. It's not a matter of you will never perform an abortion if there's a chance of saving the fetus. It's just a matter of you will never perform an abortion, period. They do let you do things like chemotherapy. If you have cancer, you're allowed to have chemotherapy even if you know it will kill the fetus, because that's not an abortion. But you may not end the pregnancy even if you know that the pregnancy is killing the woman. And that's the official policy of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. And the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops are, they're the hierarchy. They're the people in charge of U.S. Catholicism. So yeah, this God does hate women. And this situation is a pretty striking example, in my opinion, of a mingling of church and healthcare. And I think just as much as we need a separation of church and state in the U.S., we also need a separation of church and healthcare. Thank you.
Hi. So something that I was wondering about is how relatively recent or historical this current really icky approach to medically necessary terminations is, as in that I don't know for sure whether I'm right about this or not, but it seems that the question of reproductive rights versus alleged religious freedom to oppress or oppose religious reproductive rights is something that's gotten a lot more focus in recent years, and it's become sort of more of a emphasized or hot button issue for both Catholics and also evangelicals. And so I'm wondering if has it always been this bad? Has that always been the policy of Catholic hospitals to sort of avoid medically necessary terminations at all costs? Or is it something that's become worse recently? And I guess also whether it's sort of more recent technological and medical advancements are the ones that are being denied relative to older medical treatments that might have been first developed at a time where this wasn't as focused on in terms of the religious rights ideology. I'm sorry, I can't talk right now. Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, I think it is ongoing. I think ever since Roe v. Wade, it's been a fairly straight line of policy. But a good source, if you want to know more in depth, is the National Women's Law Center report, Below the Radar, and it goes into great detail. But I think what's new actually is not so much the policy as a little bit more reporting on it than there has been in the past. And I'm hoping that there will be more. I've been suggesting to Michael Dodora at the Center for Inquiry in the U.S. That this could be one of his public policy things, and he thinks it's a good idea. And I think, if we can get a whole bunch of organizations like FFRF, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, and Americans United Against and United for Separation of Church and State, and the SSA, the Secular Coalition of America, just all those groups, get them all putting their voices behind this, there's a chance we could get more attention to it. And once people start paying attention, then I think it'll snowball, because it gets people's attention once they pay attention to it, because it's outrageous, and everybody sees it's outrageous. And that was the point of this Irish story. The people in California saying, "What? You're kidding? That can't happen." They don't realize, yeah, it can happen, in your town. So I think that's the new thing, is people looking into it a little bit more than the practice. I suspect the practice has been going on since Roe v. Wade.
In Canada and Quebec, when the church had such a hold. In Quebec, it was practice that if a woman's health was in jeopardy, they would simply let the woman die. And that was very, very common. So it's not recent, and it's... That's right. No, but that's right. That's why it's so important to separate. But it was, you had women that was basically there just to produce children for the church. And they had 14, 15, 18, 20 kids. And some of them survived, some didn't. And it was against policy, a church policy, to use birth control. So it's not recent.
Yeah. Okay, I hate to be the one to ask the what about the men question. But the Catholic Church has a lot of other doctrines about reproduction that it enforces, do these hospitals also limit things like vasectomies, hysterectomies, all kinds of other reproductive options that might inhibit? And I'll also mention the recent Irish scandal about the symphysiotomies that were going on. That they were actually carrying out invasive medical procedures against women in labor to facilitate their ability to get pregnant again. So do you know if they've done anything like restricting vasectomies in Catholic hospitals?
Yeah. As far as I know, Catholic hospitals just flatly refuse to do them. And that is, as far as I know, that's one where they wouldn't, even comparatively reasonable administrations wouldn't make a fuss, because that's not a medical emergency. So they wouldn't have any qualms about saying, sorry, you have to go 2 states over to get that done.